Conspiracy theories, his fear-mongering, his outright lies about the Biden-Harris administration's handling of the southern border. In just a few moments, the vice president will land in Tucson, Arizona. She will be delivering remarks at the southern border in a few hours as part of a push to highlight her policies, as well as Trump's record on the border. In particular, his plan or his successful effort to kill that bipartisan deal just because it would have handed the Biden administration a win on immigration. Here's what she had to say about that in an MSNBC exclusive interview with my colleague Steph Rule.
Well, first of all, we do have a broken immigration system, and it needs to be fixed. And if we take a step back, months ago, some of the most conservative members of the United States Congress came together with others, proposed a border security bill that would have put 1,500 new border agents on the border to help those hardworking border agents who are there right now working around the clock, would have put more money into stemming the flow of fentanyl, which is killing Americans around our country and devastating communities, would have put more resources into our ability to prosecute transnational criminal organizations, which in my career I've prosecuted. Donald Trump got word of the bill, realized it was going to fix a problem he wanted to run on, and told him to kill the bill, don't put it up for a vote. He killed a bill that would have actually been a solution because he wants to run on a problem.
Now, you don't have to just take her word for it if you don't want to. You could also ask one of the architects of the bill she's talking about there, ultra-conservative Republican Senator James Lankford. He's the guy who mouthed the words, "That's true," when President Joe Biden told the same story she just did and touted this bipartisan border bill during his State of the Union address earlier this year. Take a listen to what he said about his own colleagues for bailing on the deal that they wanted back in January.
It is interesting. Republicans 4 months ago would not give funding for Ukraine, for Israel, and for our southern border because we demanded changes in policy. So we actually locked arms together and said, we're not going to give you money for this. We want a change in law. And now it's interesting, a few months later, when we're finally getting to the end, they're like, oh, just kidding. I actually don't want a change in law because it's a presidential election year.
So if you're following along, Republicans got almost everything they wanted in this bipartisan bill. President Joe Biden was going to sign it into law. But then Trump got mad, so Republicans killed the bill to help Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Donald Trump is now, when he's not busy, peddling dangerous racist lies about Haitian immigrants eating labradoodles or whining about getting impeached over trying to extort Ukraine, as he did today in his meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Well, when he's not doing those things, he's hawking $100,000 watches. The Harris campaign laying out some specific plans to tackle immigration and the border in a brand new ad ahead of her visit today. Watch that.
Kamala Harris has never backed down from a challenge. She put cartel members and drug traffickers behind bars, and she will secure our border. Here's her plan: hire thousands more border agents, enforce the law and step up technology, and stop fentanyl smuggling and human trafficking. We need a leader with a real plan to fix the border, and that's Kamala Harris.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
The vice president getting herself on offense on the issue of immigration with a visit to the southern border is where we start today. Here with me at the table, co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, Alicia Menendez is back. Also back, the Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network. Political columnist and host of the podcast In Politic for Puck is back as well. MSNBC national affairs analyst, that is John Heilemann. Heilemann, I thought this was Biden's one of the best moments and one of the best State of the Union addresses he's had during his presidency. It was, you know, there was a lot of call and response. There was a lot of President Biden sort of owning the Republicans. But this participation by this very, very conservative Republican who said that is true, I thought was a moment that could sort of make a comeback in the campaign, and Kamala Harris is making sure it does.
Yeah, and you know, look, you couldn't script that one. I mean, I'm relatively certain that James Lankford was not a planned thing when he did that. That gave his assent to what Joe Biden said. You know, as I'm always inclined to do in these situations, has anybody called Senator Lankford and asked him who he's voting for in the election this year? And I don't know the answer to that question, so I won't impute. But I would, you know, I've not seen him yet endorse Kamala Harris. And it would be an incredible thing if he, at least on this issue, were to speak out and not just mouth words in the Senate chamber. And I bet the Harris campaign has at least asked to try to make that happen.
It's such an interesting point, because if you care about these things, the choice is as stark on the issue of immigration as anything. I mean, she's for doing a bill with so much Republican stuff in it. It's actually difficult for some parts of her coalition.
Indeed, indeed. I think what is interesting here is she knows that she has to go in there and get at this attack that he continues to level against her, that she is not going to be sufficiently strong on the border. So she has to answer that question of strength. And then she needs to show that she has a plan, that she actually has a way of approaching that. Some of that proof is already in the pudding, in the form of what the Biden administration has done just in this past year to increase legal pathways into the United States, which is why we have seen border crossings fall 70% since their peak in December. What they are doing is already working. I would argue, though, that in addition to doing that, in addition to meeting Donald Trump where he is on this argument about the border, that she should go a step further and embrace the duality of saying we can secure our border and we can also protect dreamers, protect DACA recipients, keep American families together, as President Biden and I have been doing in our parole in place policy, where if you are an undocumented person married to an American citizen, you can now have an expedited path in order to be here legally. She can be the candidate who is offering Americans both. And that is, to me, the only way she really gets out ahead of Donald Trump on this issue.
Well, it's so interesting because her campaign has been very adept at weaving the Project 2025 greatest hits into some of their messaging. And some of the most, I mean, I think we did a whole hour over the summer, I think you were there, on the Project 2025 immigration chapter with no other news hook other than we all read it and thought, oh my God.
This is bananas.
It's bananas. And it's some of the most extreme stuff that he's running on in Trump 3.0.
Well, because he let the architect of family separation into some strange test kitchen where he would come up, Stephen Miller, with things that are fundamentally un-American, right? Talking about denaturalizing naturalized American citizens, talking about going into American communities where people sit in the church pew next to you, go to school with your kid, are part of the fabric of your life. And somehow he's going to rip those 11 million people and in many cases send them back to a country where they may not even know the language there. So there is what he has already done, and there is what he is promising to do. And I think part of the task for the Harris campaign is tying those two things together.
It's another example, too, where she's the one standing with the guys in uniforms, in this case, Border Patrol agents.
And I think that's smart, because he has tried to miscast her as some far left crazy. And she is not that. She was a prosecutor. He is the prosecuted. And I think that people need to be reminded of that all the time. But I also think that she should do both and dealing with, she needs to emphasize that the crossings at the border have gone down much further than they were under Trump, who she's running against. She needs to also talk about preserving families. And I would add a dimension. She needs to remind them the reason we want to keep families together and the border crossing down is we see them as human beings, unlike my opponent who thinks some immigrants are eating your cats and dogs. So his policy is not only not working, he dehumanizes people, which is un-American. I would keep in his face what he's been saying about the people that even the Republican governor has denounced about what he said in Springfield, Ohio. Those are immigrants, too. And we cannot lose our humanity as Americans in order to protect our borders. We can do both at the same time.
Especially in the case of Haitians, since we're talking about immigrants who are in this country legally through temporary protected status.
And building businesses and doing well.
Going to church and going to school. And